Alright, so it's record-breaking time. Which record in particular? U.S. gasoline consumption. Hello and welcome back to the podcast once again, everybody. As always, PayPal and Patreon links are both down below for anybody who wants to support me. Only do so if you actually can. But the weekly updated U.S. demand numbers. So just to start off with, in general, U.S. oil consumption is back up into its normal range and actually is heading towards the upper end of its normal range. Usually in present day, it's between 20 and 22 under normal circumstances, thanks to the huge fuel efficiency upgrade revolution, if you want to call that, over the course of the late 2000s and the early 2010s. U.S. oil consumption has primarily stayed pretty level between 20 and 22 million barrels a day up until just recently, before last year happened. But even though the U.S. population is thankfully increasing at a slower and slower rate, it is still an increasing population. So inevitably, once the fuel efficiency drive went about as far as it can go, at least, the unescapable factor of the still increasing population was inevitably going to take back control, and thus the higher end of U.S. oil consumption numbers started pushing higher, and almost got up to 23 million barrels per day at the highest point. Then last year happened, and during the initial mega global shutdown in the first initial wave of panic from the situation last year, U.S. oil consumption, like everybody else's oil consumption, crashed initially for a month or two as everything stopped happening. So U.S. oil demand dropped as low as just under 14, down to about 13.7 million barrels a day. And it jumped back up pretty quickly, up to about 17. And then from there on, over the course of fall, winter, and into spring, it really gradually climbed back up through 18, 19, and finally for the last several weeks now has been back up over 20, and now has reached the highest point it's been at since the initial crash of last year, and has gone up over 21.5 million barrels per day. The individual numbers comprising that being the main focus of the title, at least, gasoline consumption breaking its previous record this past week. Whereas the previous record was set back in, I think it was actually 2018, but it might have been 2019, and it got as high as almost 10 million, literally just under it at 9.99. And this past week, it broke that record and got up over 10 million barrels per day of gasoline consumption, getting all the way up to 10.04. And looking at the others, U.S. diesel fuel consumption came in still around its usual range for present day. Usually it's around 4 million barrels a day, with most recent numbers coming in this time as 3.84 million barrels a day. U.S. jet fuel consumption, which took the hardest hit percentage-wise from the effects of last year, many of which are still in place. Normally in present day, U.S. jet fuel consumption was around 2 million barrels a day or so, and it actually stayed there for a little while. U.S. jet fuel consumption, when the situation struck and everything shut down, U.S. jet fuel consumption got as low as only about 600,000 barrels a day, and it crept back up towards like 900 and was kind of staying there for a while until the last number of months, better part of this year so far. It's been usually about 1 or 1.1, and as we've been hitting this past month or so, it's been starting to go up into 1.2 and 1.3. This most recent time coming in at 1.37. U.S. oil-derived propane consumption coming in this time at 1.12. U.S. marine fuel consumption, fuel oil for ocean-going vessels, has a decent bit of fluctuation to it. Its rough average is usually between 300 and 400,000 barrels a day, but the actual individual weekly numbers have a wide range of fluctuation, like this one actually coming in only at 178,000 barrels a day, and the classification under the EIA of other, aka literally everything else, came in this time just under 5 at 4.98 million barrels a day, which is a bit above the usual. Usually that number is closer down to around 4 or so. And they don't provide a weekly breakdown of that, but I can at least go down the list for you of what the usual average makeup of it is. The biggest chunk of the other category is usually ethane and ethylene. Nowadays, usually up to about 1.8 million barrels a day, upwards of 200, even as high as 300 sometimes, 1,000 barrels a day of that in present day, because of the afterworld left by last year is being used to make hand sanitizer. The majority, the 1.5 million barrels a day or so, is primarily going towards making plastics, most of which the bulk weight will be polyethylene, which is the most common type of plastic. But a fair bit of it will also be making other things, including some things that are under the plastic umbrella term that people don't actually realize are considered under the plastic umbrella term. Things such as the fibers for carpets, urethane and polyurethane foam, the primary material for pillows, mattresses, and cushions, for seats of all kinds, couches, car seats, computer seats, and everything. And then outside of the ethane and ethylene portion, the other bits of the other category is composed of usually about 250,000 barrels a day of pentanes, hexanes, and cycloalkanes, the majority of which get used to make styrofoam, as well as refrigerants, the coolant for refrigerators and freezers and air conditioners. About 250,000 barrels a day of butane. A huge chunk of that ends up being used to make butadiene, which gets combined with vinyl compounds, the end result being rubber. About 250,000 barrels a day usually is petroleum coke. About 350,000 barrels a day usually of petrochemical production. About, on average, although it fluctuates with seasons, but on average about 300,000 barrels a day being used as asphalt and pavement. About 100,000 barrels a day usually of lubricant compounds, motor oil, grease. About another 100,000 barrels a day of some other stuff that includes things like stuff like hydraulic fluids and the like, and usually around 600,000 barrels a day of still gas, which is primarily cycled through to the burner or the heating units and used as the fuel for the refinery system itself. So while an oil refinery is running, it's basically self-sustaining, as it's running off of the otherwise would-be unused gas coming out of the petroleum that it's refining. And to close it out, U.S. oil production had gotten up to about 13 million barrels a day before the situation and the price crash and everything happened. But then last year the price crash happened. U.S. drilling rig count crashed from 800 active drilling rigs down to about 250. Now it was already on its way down, very slowly though. It had previously been up over 1,000, but it was hanging out around 800. It crashed down to 250, stayed there for a few months, recovered really slowly back up to about 280. Since then, it has been recovering at a more decent pace and is almost back up to about 500, currently at 479. And with most of that production coming from shale, about like 8 million barrels a day out of that 13 million. That took a decent hit. It dropped it down to like 10.5. It has managed to be brought back up to 11.3 now. Either way, that's it for now. So thank you for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are both down there if anybody wants to support me. Again, only do so if you actually can. May God bless and protect and save all of you, and I will see you all around next time.